morning, I am Dr. Deepa V and I am an assistant professor in the Department of English, Shahid Bhagat Singh College, University of Delhi. So today's topic is, as you see, it is on gender and language. Now, what are these two words mean? What do these two words mean? For example, is there a relationship between gender and language, right? So if so, how does gender influence language and how language becomes gender specific? Before we begin, let me tell you a small story. This is an exercise or an experiment that we see which was conducted by a professor in an American university. So what did he do? He went to his class and there was a class of both male students as well as female students, and he asked them to write down some of the words that came to their mind. So what did the male students as well as female students do? So this is a very interesting exercise, and as you can see that what the male students did were, their vocabulary consisted of words that talked about travel, adventure, sports, business, economics, politics, outdoor life. But there was a difference in the choice of words by the female students. What did the female students write about? So their choice of words, or they were more oriented towards writing about beauty, colors, fragrance, art, friendship, food items and domestic life. Now we can come to the inference that male students and their construction of vocabulary is more abstract, and when we talk about female students, their construction or their preference of words is more concrete and ornamental. Now does this bring in that link, or do we try to understand that link, that there is some link between gender as well as language? There is an interconnection between gender and language. Now again, to reinstate this or to go further with another example which is very common, you must have heard it in your college or among your friends about women having to be assertive. For example, have you heard this? Tanu, you need to be assertive in order to get your point taken seriously. Now when this is told, what do you infer from this? A, we can come to the reading that Tanu, being a female, she need to be more assertive in her vocabulary, which means her vocabulary or the language that she uses to converse is not assertive enough, which means that she is not brought up or she is not used to being assertive. So it just gets reflected in her language. Now with this premise, now let us go on to another term to further to understand between the links between gender and language, gendering language. Now as you see, what is this gendering language? Before we go on to what is gendering, let us look at language. So when you talk about language, what do we know? We know that there are two forms, and one is oral and the other one is written form. So when I talk to you about oral form, how do we understand again, or what is the purpose of using the language? We use it for conversation, which means there is a dialogue which is more conversational. As well as when you talk about language being in the written form, it is used for the purpose of reading as well as writing. Now again, this leaves us with a very interesting and a pertinent question. Is there a difference in which men and women use the language, right? So now again, what do we do? How do we understand? Let us now consider this sentence, close the door. Okay, this is a small sentence and it is a phrase, close the door, but let us look at how men and women use it. So when men use it, and if you observe, what do they say? They say very directly, right? Close the door, please. But when women use the same sentence, what do they, or how do they put it? They use it, will you please close the door? Which means you can understand that there is in the second sentence, which means will you please close the door, it denotes that there is a certain lack of assertiveness, right? There is lack of assertiveness, and then it denotes that there is some sense of hesitation when the female student, the female is trying to communicate it, as well as there is she is being more polite when she wants to convey her ideas about or convey a request, which means that will you please close the door. So here in the first sentence, where you see that there is a certain sense of assertion and authority. A man, when he is trying to put his words across, he is more assertive, he is more certain. But when a woman is trying to communicate, we see these differences. When we look at these differences, for example, considering this close the door phrase and how men and women apply language in real life, we see there is a difference in the way that they communicate. So this happens because of factors like physical, psychological, economic and social differences in the way that men and women approach life. Now this I would like to, again, when you talk about these gender issues and language issues, we very well understand they are very interconnected. And since the time that we see women's movement began, and feminist as well as the women movement, people in the women movement, they started debating the power of language. So we understand that gender studies as well as language studies have become very important interdisciplinary fields as far as academia is concerned. So what do we infer? That language does reflect the existing social reality. So sociolinguists as well as feminist scholars are examining how language is trying to either does it uphold or does it support or does it devalue women, and how does it shape the social and cultural context in the world, right? So with this now, to understand, we will look at the following terms that we see. Right. First of all, let us begin with this term. So what is the first term that we look at, or how do we understand this, going on to find out the difference or the relationship between language as well as gender is that. So when first we look at sex versus gender. Now let us consider this premise. A child is born. What do? You go there and we want to refer to the sex of the child. You ask the child, you ask what is the sex of the child, whether it is the male child or the female child. We do not go and ask what is the gender of the child. So you see that sex is a biological identity, whereas gender is a socio-cultural construct, right? So when you have to understand this, or when we need to further understand this premise, what do? We can have a small experiment which you can do for yourself. You go to a toy store and what do? You can ask for toys as for boys as well as for girls. So when you do that, you can examine the shopkeeper and his choice of gifts that he would be giving for boys as well as for girls. So when you ask for some gifts for boys, what does he come up with, or what are his choices? He comes up with guns, he comes up with cars, etc., right? But when it comes to girls, it will be either dolls or it will be either kitchen sets, etc. And also you can note that they are framed or they come in pink colors. So with this premise, you see that a girl or a boy is brought up according to the socio-cultural norms of his or her society. And how do they, from the time once they are born, slowly they start acquiring these traits which the society wants them to imbibe, or which the society wants them to grow with, and that is how these socio-cultural norms gets constructed in the society. Now in this context, I would like to quote or bring in a quote about a very famous feminist scholar by name Simone de Beauvoir, who says that one is not born but becomes a woman. I quote, one is not born but becomes a woman. Now what does this mean? This precisely means that, sex remains, it is just a biological identity, whereas gender is slowly you acquire, or you slowly begin to acquire these traits, and that is how your identity, or that is how these socio-cultural norms determine your idea or the idea of gender. So idea of gender is it's not a constant thing, it keeps on changing as much as in relation to how the society is. So in this context, again you must have heard all these popular phrases being used, right? Boys will be boys, don't cry like a girl, they say. So this is how very unconsciously we are trying to bring in, or we are trying to bring in these ideas of gender and both male as well as female. Now in this context, let us understand a few more terms. Now let's go on to the first term, which for us to understand, right, when I tell you about how gender or how the idea of gender takes root. So we see that easily these categories get formed between male as well as female, or boys as well as girls. So slowly the male child is expected to be strong, the male child is expected to be brave, whereas the female child is expected to be very docile. So likewise these gender boundaries get set and they keep changing within time. So you can see that, imagine like 100 years ago, men were not wearing earrings or women were not wearing jeans, and especially men were not coming out for work, they were not driving planes, but that is not the case right now we see today. So these gender boundaries also keep evolving with time, though over a period of time they keep changing as the society keeps changing. The next term that we would see in this context is gender identity. What is gender identity and how does gender identity get formed? Gender identity, as the child grows, there are markers like voice, physique, dress, hairstyle, behavior and language, and all these components as the person is growing, it gives him or her an inner sense of being. Is she being a male or is he being a male or is she being a female? So these things get developed in childhood. So forming one's identity is what we call as gender identity. Now next, going on to the term gender stereotype. So gender stereotype again is a very common word that you must have heard. So now for this, what you need to do, if you can experiment again, do a small experiment and see. Take a newspaper and look at the matrimonial columns. You will see very commonly this is being expected of women, that women are slim, tall, fair, beautiful. So these are the stereotypes that again form what it is to be a woman, and what are these stereotypes. This is how they get constructed. What I mean by stereotype is there are certain standards which the society sets forth, right, which means women have to be slim, tall, beautiful, polite, so on and so forth. And what does the society do for men? Men have to be dominant and assertive. Again, imagine there is a snake in the backyard. What happens? There are some boys as well as there are some girls. So what is expected of the boys to do? They need to come forward and they need to be dominant there. We need to be present the situation and find some remedy for it, right? Whereas women, they can scream, shout, and it is an expected behavior, but it is not the same expected behavior to express his fear. For a man to express that he is scared, for a man, that these are the things that are not expected for a man or a young boy even to behave. So this is how stereotypes get formed, right? Next, going on to the other important term, what we call it as gender ideology. Now what is gender ideology? Gender ideology are set of attitudes and some values about, I quote this proper, the word proper, quote unquote the word proper, about the proper role of men and women in the family or society. Now what are these attitudes and values and how are they expected to be proper, and what is being proper in fact? So this is again an example that you can see. Say for example, during the very famous Nirbhaya case, which shook the whole society, which shook our whole country, there was a lot of criticism initially, right, on why was she out at night in order to cite an inappropriate behavior. Rather, you should have condemned the men, you should have condemned the crime, but that did not happen initially. So there is a certain proper role, or there is a certain appropriate behavior that is expected out of a woman, and as well as for men as well. So as I said, these are certain attitudes and values about being proper, and this is how ideology becomes to set forth in the society. And for example, if you look at a man must be competitive. If he is not competitive, if he is not willing enough to participate, then he is again not considered to be a very successful man. So a woman must be patient, a woman must be tolerant. So these are again all these ideologies which the society frames for both men as well as women. Now going on to another interesting term, by this what do we see, or what do we look at? How do these things happen actually? So these things happen through again these three factors that we look in. One is physical, another one is psychological, and another one is personality. So these are the traits slowly men as well as women acquire, and these are the traits that appropriate being what is being quote unquote being male as well as female. So if you look at physically, men are expected to be strong, they are expected to be aggressive, they are expected again to be rational and analytical. They cannot express their emotions, right? If you see there is a sad situation, how many of us have seen men sitting and weeping loudly or crying loudly? They are expected to completely suppress their emotions and act with logic or rationality most of the times. As well as when we look at psychologically, how are men expected to be again? They are expected to be problem solvers. Always they need to find a solution, right? So, and then with that comes their personality trait of being daring, and they need to be dominant, right? And now when we talk about women, women are again, when you talk about the physique of women, the accepted norms or the accepted standards would be they are small, petite and pretty. So these are again the traits that define or that qualify to be a female. Again, how is the psychology? Psychology is they are very creative, very artistic, very imaginative, so very also emotional, right? So these are the psychological traits that is develops as far as when we talk about women are concerned or female behavior is concerned. Now when we talk about personality, what do we see as far as women are concerned is, since consequently always they are dealing with community and always they are dealing with others, so we see their language becomes more conciliatory, there is more empathy, sympathy in their language, there is more affection in their language, there is more docility in their language, and there is a lot of unassertiveness, which means that kindness gets to mark their personality. So this is how we see the personality, psychology as well as the physical traits as far as male and female are concerned. Now we see, is there now again coming on to the same debate about do men and women use language differently? Is there a difference in both men and women speak, in the way they converse, in their dialogues, etc. So when we talk about the social and cultural norms, how does language mirror or how does language transmit these differences? So these gender differences are marked in various ways. Say for example, when we talk about do women and men speak different languages, what is the answer that we get? The answer is both yes as well as a no. No, because it's the same language we speak, right? For example, take English. Both men speak English as well as women speak English. In this case, when we see, because their phrases, expressions, intonations, they are so different, right? And they appear to be speaking different languages. And when we look at, for example, this book on Language Its Nature by Otto Jespersen, what is the name of the book by means its nature, development and origin. What do we understand is that he observes that men have different expressions which are very peculiar to them, but women understand them but they do not use, as well as on the other hand women have words and phrases which men know but they never use, fear of being scorned at or being mocked at. So this is the reason that we see language of men and women appear to be very different.